Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Laidlaw. I am going to be moderating today's webinar, so welcome. We'll be discussing today the EU Digital Services Act, future directions and policy implications for Canada. And to kickstart our discussion today, I'm honored to introduce you to Renata Nicolai. She is the Deputy Director General of the European Commission's Directorate General for Communications Networks, Content and Technology, known as DG Connect. She specializes in digital policy, data governance, and platform regulation, and plays a leading role in implementing Europe's digital decade and driving Europe's digital competitiveness. Welcome, Renata.
Thank you very much for having me in this seminar, Emily. Good morning to participants in Canada. Good afternoon to those participating from Europe. It's great to have this occasion, to start discussions with you on this important topic. I would like to thank also our delegation for organizing this seminar, and also I would like to thank Mr. McCarn, who will be opening this seminar together with me after my opening remarks. It comes at a very good moment, this seminar, because we just had a rather important EU-Canada summit on the 23rd of June, which was certainly an expression of the will of our political leaders to stimulate and develop our strategic, economic, and political partnership even further. In this context, we have a digital partnerships that since 2023, and that digital partnerships is plenty-fold because it includes, of course, that we work together also on regulatory convergence where it's possible. That includes also, of course, the online platforms governance, but it also stretches over to research cooperation, to future cutting-edge technologies such as semiconductors, quantum, or artificial intelligence. So a digital partnership that is really more than just, talking about regulatory convergence. So this is a first series of outreach, activities that we want to kind of do, in particular, also on the online platform rules. You know that we've been pioneering in Europe with these rules, and it is, of course, important with allies like Canada to kind of, engage in a discussion to see are there kind of, convergence possibilities, especially at a time where a lot of our aspects of the digital platform rules are kind of overlaid with myths in the public debate, and where it's useful to share what it is and what it isn't. And I'm very happy that I can do that, because I am indeed in my role with many in my teams in the machine room of the day-to-day business of enforcing this Digital Services Act that we are talking about today. So maybe a little bit of genesis around this. The Digital Services Act did not come out of the blue. It was the result of a very long kind of work with the platforms in different fora. We had years of self-regulatory cooperation. We had, for instance, a code of conduct on illegal hate speech. We had a code of practice on disinformation, and that allowed us over years to really work well with the platforms, but also with civil society, in particular in these important areas of work. So when we then kind of decided to move away from this self-regulatory soft law process to a hard law process and go into an interinstitutional process, which is in Europe means that the Commission, we propose it, and then it's discussed with the member states and with the European Parliament, and that's what we managed, and that's what brought about a DSA. Of course, we built on this experience from the self-regulatory context. Here, it's important that in our doing, we were always guided by striking the important kind of balance between, on the one hand, bringing accountability to the platforms, but on the other hand, being very respectful for the fundamental rights. And this is, I think, the thread that runs throughout the DSA. And it is not a content law. It is a risk-based approach that we built to increase the accountability of the platforms. So what are the kind of characteristics of that? So we do not away with the liability exemptions that in general continue to exist for service providers, but we increase their due diligence. We increase that in a risk-based approach, and I'll come back to that. We also empower users better. So users get much more kind of rights that they can kind of, deploy vis-a-vis the platforms. A thread that runs throughout the DSA is also transparency, because transparency is key to kind of get a better input, a better kind of, look into the black boxes of the recommender system, of the algorithmic structures that are so important for the platforms. But transparency also for an ecosystem around us. For instance, also for researchers communities around us, and not only researchers in Europe, but also researchers in third countries such as Canada. We just kind of adopted a delegated act that will provide access for vetted researchers. So they have to go through a vetting process, but then they can actually get quite detailed data from the platforms that will be very important. Or also for the general public, there is a big database and it has billions of entries already that includes the statement of reasons from the platforms when they are actually moderating content. Transparency is really important. So what's the risk-based approach? The risk-based approach means that we are looking at kind of the very large online platforms, and they are those that have more than 45 million users per month in the EU, in a different way from the smaller ones. So the very large online platforms, the VLOPs as we call them, have to conduct risk assessments, and they have to show us how to mitigate the risks. So this is an important work that they have to do regularly, and when doing so, they must kind of deal with the risks also the negative effects on fundamental rights. So we have already seen examples where they have kind of, produced the risk assessments, the audit reports, because they are also part of an auditing process that has really been an important aspect to show the transparency in the system. Where are we after almost 2 years of enforcement? Has it changed anything? I would say the glass is half full. The platforms are definitely on a kind of a journey. They have started, streamlining, for instance, the processes to report illegal content. They have kind of, empowered users more. Users, for instance, have now on many platforms the possibility to opt out of recommender systems based on personal profiling. That didn't exist before. They have provided many platforms better complaint handling, notice and action systems. And of course, we have this transparency context because we have now these regular risk assessments reports, as I said, the audit reports and so on. We have also, of course, enforced the law in terms of, starting enforcement actions when we see that the risk assessments are not kind of convincing us that the risks have been effectively mitigated. So we have started 14 enforcement actions, and we have focused in this first phase of the DSA enforcement on key priority areas, and they are minor protection online, they are the safety of the online marketplaces, they are around the transparency rules because they are so important, and they are around election integrity because we were immediately heading for European Parliament elections, and we have a lot of national elections in the member states of the European Union all the time. So I want to underline that starting an enforcement action, for us, our philosophy is not that this is a fining machine. It's not about, necessarily coming to a fine decision. It is more about changing the behavior of the platforms and changing them in a way that they become more compliant with the DSA. And here I want to highlight two kind of progress, two processes where we did not have to go to a fine and where we kind of could generate a change of behavior. In the area of online marketplaces, regarding our investigations into AliExpress, we just recently put a package together that includes a very strong kind of commitment part from the side of AliExpress that is part of our regulatory dialogue that we continue also when an enforcement action is started, and where they have offered kind of commitments in the area of transparency on advertisement, but also notice and action, compliant handling, which really kind of will make the user, bring the user in a better position. Another example in the area of minor protection online, TikTok. wanted to kind of roll out the so-called TikTok Lite rewards program that had hugely addictive features in the app. And since we already had an enforcement action on the addictive system in their general kind of, structure, and on top of that, they wanted to kind of, do this reward program, we kind of said, if you do that now, we will consider interim measures. And they then, following this kind of, conversation, they committed that they would not roll that out. So these are just two examples to show that it's not only about us kind of going all the way to a fining situation, but rather kind of engaging in an enforcement process with the platform so that we bring about change. Minor protection online is really key for us. It's a hugely debated issue, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. And we will have next Monday, on the 14th of July, a sort of a minor protection online moment, because we will adopt our guidelines. We can do that sometimes. So that's another instrument in the DSA that we can specify the due diligence rules for platforms even more. We will do that in the context of minor protection online. And at the same time, we will roll out a pilot phase for an age verification system that we built on the digital wallet that we will roll out in Europe next year for all citizens. And we anticipate that in the context of minor protection online to verify the age of the, of the user, which is very important when you think, for instance, of adult content platforms, which we also have under our supervision. The fourth area that I just want to highlight before closing is election integrity. That's probably the most difficult area in the current public debate about, the Digital Services Act. Is it censorship, or is it kind of, respecting the freedom of speech? When we are working on election integrity with the platforms, it's really not about specific content. It's really more about making sure that in the very, very important phase in the run-up to an election, everybody knows what to do. Because when you have, for instance, individual violations of criminal law, then national authorities can come with orders. That's not for us, the supervisors in general, to do. We look at systemic risks, but these individual illegal content aspects can be done by the national authorities. So this is of key importance if you have, for instance, the violation of electoral laws and the run-up to an election. So we bring in this kind of work on election integrity everybody around the table. We organize roundtables together with the national authorities because we have a double enforcement system. We deal with the very large unmanned platforms, but we do it together with the national authorities in the member states. And these roundtables are really where we are only the facilitator if the national authorities want us to help. And we bring everybody around the table, the cyber people, the electoral people, the digital services people, the platforms, the civil society, because we all need to have a protocol 24/7 in mind if things go wrong. Also in what we are observing more and more in hybrid attacks, where we can have cyber attacks combined with online manipulation. We have seen this happening in the context of European elections in member states. So this is not trivial, and we have to prepare us better. So for me, this is just to give you a snapshot of where we are. It's a journey that is not always easy, but it's a journey that is worth having, because I think we are all kind of, united here, that what we really want is an online environment that is safer, that remains open, where freedom of speech is absolutely respected, but where we also push the platforms in kind of, taking more responsibility for the systems that they build. And by increasing the transparency, we will certainly bring about change. With that, thank you very much. And I would like to, wish you a very good discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renata. It is indeed a journey, isn't it? And that was such helpful, I think, detail about the work that's being done to implement the DSA. For everyone who is watching, I will circle back to go over some of the detail about some of the rules in the DSA to set us up for the panel discussion. But before then, I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker who's providing welcoming remarks is Blair McMurran. He is the Acting Associate Assistant Deputy Minister at Canadian Heritage. And he specializes in digital policy, cultural policy, and regulatory affairs. And he has played a key role in shaping Canada's approach to online platforms. Welcome, Blair.
Okay, thanks very much, Emily. I'm hoping people can hear me well. Bonjour, hello, Pichashig. C'est un plaisir de m'adresser à vous dans mon rôle de sous-ministre adjoint délégué des Affaires culturelles au ministère du Patrimoine canadien. Je tiens à souligner que je me trouve sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé des Algonquins Anishinaabe à Gatineau, dans la région de la capitale nationale. Je remercie sincèrement la délégation de l'Union européenne au Canada pour l'organisation de ce webinaire aujourd'hui, ainsi que mon homologue Renata pour ses mots d'ouverture. Très probant, je trouvais. Je souhaite également la bienvenue à toutes les participantes et participants présents aujourd'hui. Une rencontre comme celle-ci nous permet non seulement de souligner les succès de nos travaux accomplis au cours de l'année, dans le cadre du partenariat, mais aussi de tourner notre regard vers le futur, évidemment, pour ce qui est contexte législatif au Canada. It's in that spirit, I gather, that we've chosen today's theme, Future Directions, Policy Implications of the DSA for Canada. Super timely, of course. As our citizens now rely heavily on digital platforms to access news, information, and cultural content, it's my department, Canadian Heritage, Canada's Culture Ministry, which has been leading the government's efforts to put in place regulatory frameworks that are both impactful and adapted to the realities of the digital age. We, the government, want to work with platforms to ensure Canadians can access news about their communities and hear stories that speak to their experiences, their lived experiences in all their diversity. At the same time, we are, of course, working diligently to ensure that the work of our artists, journalists, and content creators is appropriately remunerated. Nous le savons bien, en Amérique du Nord, la dominance des plateformes numériques, qui sont pour la plupart évidemment américaine et anglophone. Ça pèse lourd. C'est une réalité, c'est un incontournable. Mais pour le gouvernement du Canada, qui s'est donné comme mandat de protéger la souveraineté culturelle du Canada, y compris son identité, ses valeurs démocratiques, l'importance du secteur audiovisuel est également incontournable. En projetant nos histoires et nos expériences sur les écrans du monde, nos productions contribuent à renforcer notre sentiment d'appartenance collective. Nos films et nos émissions abordent des thèmes qui nous sont propres, avec des mots et des images qui résonnent pour nous. Ils renforcent les liens qui nous unissent de notre expérience actuelle à l'histoire que nous avons bâtie, jusqu'au chemin que nous traçons pour l'avenir. C'est dans cette optique que le Conseil de la découvrabilité, discoverability du contenu culturel a été introduit pour la première fois dans la loi canadienne avec la loi sur la diffusion contenu en ligne adoptée en 2023. Depuis, le CRTC, notre organisme de réglementation en matière de radiodiffusion, a entrepris des consultations qui ont mené à l'adoption d'exigences de contribution financière de base applicables aux plateformes en ligne. D'autres étapes suivront, notamment sur la découvrabilité même et la définition du contenu canadien. Le gouvernement demeure engagé à travailler avec toutes les parties prenantes pour livrer aux Canadiennes et Canadiens un accès à un contenu qui reflète notre réalité, nos langues officielles, nos langues et cultures autochtones et notre identité, chez nous, par nous, mais accès vers le monde. Against the backdrop of long-term job losses in journalism, particularly in local, rural, and Indigenous communities, the government also passed the Online News Act in 2023 to address the imbalance in the digital news ecosystem. That act establishes a framework for mandatory bargaining between news businesses and platforms with the goal of fairly compensating news outlets for the value they generate. While the act has faced criticism, it has already produced tangible results. Google has committed $100 million per year to support Canadian journalism under the Act's framework. This funding is now being distributed through the Canadian Journalism Collective, a nonprofit organization representing hundreds of news outlets from towns and cities across the country. In addition, the government continues to support Canadian journalism through programs like the Local Journalism Initiative, the Canada Periodical Fund, and through tax credits for both news media organizations and for subscribers to their content. Together, These efforts strive to safeguard a strong, diverse, and independent news media sector, one that Canadians can trust to keep them informed on the issues that matter to them. Au-delà de la santé de l'écosystème médiatique et créatif, nous sommes conscients que les plateformes numériques présentent des défis complexes pour le bien-être des utilisateurs, malgré les avantages considérables qu'elles offrent à notre société et notre économie. And so it is that in recent years, the Government of Canada has also pursued and implemented several measures to better equip Canadians to navigate the digital space safely. The Digital Safety Agenda, effectively. Cela inclut l'initiative de citoyenneté numérique, Digital Citizen Initiative, qui vise à renforcer la résilience des citoyens face à la désinformation en ligne, à établir des partenariats pour soutenir un écosystème d'information saine et à financer des organisations tierces pour mener des recherches et des activités centrées sur les citoyens afin de lutter contre la désinformation et d'autres préjudices en ligne. Between 2021 and 2023, the government conducted broad open consultations on online harms, as many of you will be aware. Participants in those consultations overwhelmingly supported a risk-based approach, the creation of a strong and independent regulator, and enhanced protections for vulnerable users, especially children. We heard loudly and clearly that the current status quo in Canada is harmful and no longer acceptable. Ces principes ont été pris en compte dans les choix politiques qui sous-tendaient le projet de loi C-63, la loi proposée sur les préjudices en ligne, présentée au Parlement en février 2024. Il aurait imposé des obligations légales aux services de médias sociaux pour réduire l'exposition des utilisateurs à des contenus préjudiciables. International legislation, international models like the DSA strongly informed Canada's proposed Online Harms Act. With its risk-based framework, as Renata mentioned, and its provisions for access to data for accredited researchers, the DSA was, frankly, the gold standard for many elements of Canada's proposed regime. Not all DSA elements were deemed appropriate or workable in a Canadian context. For example, during the consultations, many participants expressed strong concerns regarding government regulation of misinformation and disinformation online, leading policymakers to not include these types of content within the scope of the proposed act. The DSA also covers a broader scope of regulated services than the proposed Online Harms Act, or C-63, which would have only included social media services. The narrower scope was developed and drafted to target those online spaces that pose the greatest risk of harm to Canadians, while also respecting rights enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and aligning with the existing regulatory landscape in Canada. Bien que le projet de loi C-63 soit mort au feuilleton en janvier 2025, son contexte et son contenu constituent une base très importante pour les travaux futurs. We are fully aware that Canada is not alone in facing these challenges. Democracies around the world are confronting similar issues, and many are proposing or implementing regulatory models adapted to their jurisdictions, or of course have done so in the case of the DSA. We see the DSA as exemplary and seminal even by establishing transparency requirements and risk mitigation obligations for platforms. In doing so, the DSA for us can be seen to represent a new era in platform accountability. That's why initiatives such as the Canada-EU Digital Partnership, where we get together to develop concrete projects for a resilient digital economy, are so important to carry the work forward. Je tiens à souligner, comme Renata l'a fait, le nouveau partenariat stratégique entre l'Union européenne et le Canada annoncé par le Premier ministre Carney, aux côtés du président Costa et de la présidente von der Leyen, le 23 juin dernier. Ce dernier renforce le rôle central de notre partenariat numérique pour rendre les plateformes en ligne plus sûres, plus inclusives et plus responsables. Les échanges francs, que j'en suis convaincu vous aurez aujourd'hui, représentent une part très importante dans cette direction. The government is also mindful, of course, of the growing influence of artificial intelligence, given its transformative potential for the cultural sector and for creative industries, and of course, the complex policy challenges that come with it. The government's working to ensure that copyright, privacy, security, and the sustainability of the creative economy are protected in this context while unleashing the full power of our Canadian innovation in the AI space. A tricky balance, but one that we're pursuing. Now is the time for Canadians and Europeans, I would say, to come together to defend, celebrate, and deepen our unique contributions to global governance through initiatives like this. And in so doing, to defend, celebrate, and deepen the shared values which underlie them. Exchanges like the one today are immensely valuable in terms of informing Canada's ongoing reflection, and it is very live and very ongoing on the way forward for us on online harms. Thank you for your engagement and for offering your expert perspectives today. Les échanges d'aujourd'hui seront, j'en suis convaincu, nourrir des réflexions concrètes sur les prochaines étapes pour nous. Merci de votre attention. Je vous souhaite d'excellentes discussions. Merci.
Thank you, Blair. And I think that is provides useful information really about influenced Canada's approach in the initial proposal with Bill C-63. And we're going to dig into that in our panel discussion. For now, I am going to take a moment with you all to essentially give a primer on the Digital Services Act and contextualize it within what is going on in Canada to then have that discussion with our panels. I, briefly introduced myself, but to give you a bit more detail. So as I said, my name's Emily Laidlaw. I am a Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law and Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary, which is on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in Southern Alberta and is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So welcome, everybody. And thank you again to the delegation of the EU to Canada for organizing this webinar. Any chance I know I can have to talk about these key issues, I'm excited for. Platform regulation is a topic of enormous importance in digital policy, and the EU was early out of the gate with the adoption of the e-commerce directive in 2000 and now onto its second generation law with the Digital Services Act. So with this brief time, I'm gonna, this webinar is really about two things. It's about learning more about the Digital Services Act. There are numerous misunderstandings about the DSA, and so this is an opportunity to dispel myths, learn how it actually works, learn about how it's being implemented in the EU. We've already learned some from Renata about that process, but also dive into some of the challenges and opportunities that go along with that. And the second is to think carefully about online harms legislation in Canada. What is going to work and not work in our country, legally, politically, and culturally. The DSA is in a way, a sounding board to think through what to do here and the extent to which Canada should be aiming for global alignment, or at least be part of the global coherence on this topic. As many who are watching know, the first attempt at an online harms bill, Bill C-63, died on the order paper in January. And that bill, as Blair mentioned, was influenced in substance by the DSA, among others. So to give you a bit of background about the DSA, this has always been a question about, I guess historically, the liability of what were known as these intermediaries. And the two primary regimes that existed, at least in the Western world, were the e-commerce directive that I mentioned that provided and continues to provide a conditional immunity to intermediaries when they acted as a host. If they obtained actual knowledge that they were hosting illegal content, then they had an obligation to act on it, to take it down. Otherwise, they risked liability for the underlying wrong. The other model is what exists in the United States, and that's been around since 1996. It was Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and it created this kind of broad immunity for intermediaries for any of the content that they hosted, including illegal content. There were only a few narrow exceptions to that. So over the next 20 years, these legal frameworks, or I'd say 25 years, were challenged in various ways. They were examined by courts. Questions emerged about, well, what does it mean to actually have knowledge of you're hosting illegal content, and so on. And in that time, the nature of platforms evolved, the harms evolved. And so the European Commission began exploring this idea of a second generation law, and the DSA, the Digital Services Act, was passed in 2022. To give you an idea of where Canada sits with this, Canada has never passed a comprehensive federal intermediary liability law or online harms law. It mainly relies on specific rules in defamation and copyright law. And with the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, it creates some limitations of what Canada can do. I think that a result of the analysis of CUSMA is that a DSA type law, a risk management type law in Canada, would be CUSMA compliant. And of course, we don't know what is coming with any future trade negotiations for Canada. Provincially, Quebec has a conditional safe harbor, and it operates a lot like the Commerce Directive. But let's take a closer look at the DSA. The DSA has two key elements. So one, it builds on the Commerce Directive. So it preserves and enhances intermediary liability rules. And through that process of the DSA, it essentially reinvigorated the democratic legitimacy of those rules, which had been a point of debate for the decades leading up to the DSA passage. The second is that I'd say the major innovation of the DSA is it introduces this idea of this risk management or due diligence obligations on service providers. And it's something new and entirely separate from a liability regime. The scope is quite broad of the DSA. It applies to companies that offer their digital services to Europeans. So this includes digital services that target EU markets or have a significant number of users from Europe. So what are these due diligence obligations? Renata walked us through some of the basic elements of that, and I'm going to kind of unpack that. So the DSA creates a tiered approach to responsibilities depending on the type or size of the digital service and their societal impact. So there's four. So the first is intermediary services. You're thinking network infrastructure services like domain name services, VPNs, internet access providers, and they have some basic universal obligations. Things like there should be a single point of contact for authorities and users, that these providers should have terms and conditions setting out how they moderate content, and there should be some basic transparency obligations, including some carve-outs for micro and small firms. The second, it would be hosting services. So this is essentially storage services that provide cloud and web hosting services. They have basic obligations, and the basic obligations are generally procedural in nature. So they have to receive notices of illegal content. They have to have a process in place. They have to have fair processes in content moderation. For example, providing reasons for decisions that were made, reporting on their awareness of illegal content that would threaten, create threats of life or safety. Now, the third, and this is where we start getting more into the risk management, would be online platforms. They're hosting services that enable public dissemination of content. So think about platforms that bring together sellers and consumers, app stores, social media, online marketplaces. These online platforms have more advanced obligations. This is where that idea of due diligence comes to life. So the platforms have to have content moderation processes. For example, they have to have fair internal complaints mechanisms. They have to have due process in those mechanisms. There has to be a due diligence when it comes to the design of their services. So think dark patterns. The design and how they design and run their interfaces has to be done in a way that avoids deception and manipulation. They have to do things like label advertising, explain recommender systems, and they have to be, there are transparency obligations. So periodic reporting of how they're complying with these basic due diligence obligations, things like how they're managing disputes, and various actions. There are also special rules when it comes to protection of minors that, for example, online platforms must proactively put in place certain measures to ensure a high level of privacy, safety, and security of minors. And that is for any platforms accessible by minors. Of course, points of debate, you know, once you scratch at the surface of that, all of this becomes quite complicated when you start thinking about how do you identify platforms that are accessible by minors and so on. The last tier is the one that's been most publicly discussed, and that is the tier of very large online platforms or very large online search engines. So VLOPs or VLOSs, those are these services that have over 45 million active European users monthly. They have special obligations to manage the risks of harm at a systemic level. So what is the risk management obligation? It's quite broad. So they have to manage the risks concerning illegal content, but also actual or foreseeable negative effects on fundamental rights, civic discourse, electoral processes. So that's the umbrella under which disinformation fits. Public security, public health, protection of minors, things like that. And also actual or foreseeable negative consequences on physical or mental well-being. So what does the risk management have to entail? It includes things like the design of their recommender systems, the content moderation systems, what are their advertising practices, data practices, what are their terms and conditions? And then crucially, the companies then need to act and mitigate these risks of harm. So this commitment is ongoing and includes things like yearly audits and compliance functions. It is a relatively complex administrative framework. When it comes to the VLOPs and VLOSs, it's primarily enforced by the European Commission, and companies can be the subject of fines of up to 6% of global turnover for serious breaches. So what I will close on before we jump into our discussion is, you know, understanding a little bit about this paradigm shift. So online platforms have extraordinary power. They are the gatekeepers to our information ecosystem, to thriving in our world. And with the mainstreaming of AI, that power is only becoming more concentrated more quickly. So a few takeaways is that the DSA is designed to be creating incentives for companies to be responsible for the harms that flow from both the design and use of their services. So it's that key shift to that management of the systemic risks of harm. But in the EU, the underlying liability framework remains in effect. That kind of basic underlying liability framework does not exist, at least on a comprehensive level in Canada. The DSA is notable because it does target mis and disinformation. So we're going to talk about that as a panel. This was a controversial point of debate in Canada, and as Blair mentioned, ultimately it was not included in Bill C-63. And a core element is this idea of transparency. And part of that key to transparency is researcher access to data. This is provided for in the DSA. This was also a core feature of Bill C-63 in Canada. And the last point is that the DSA in the end it's a framework. Much is being developed through various guidelines. So for example, the Commission recently sought feedback on draft guidelines to protect minors. And last year they published guidelines on mitigation of systemic risks for elections. So in many ways, the legislation is where they start. And then because of the evolving nature, a lot of this is developed in more detail through these guidelines. So thank you for for listening in to my short primer on the DSA. And I hope that sets us up for a really exciting discussion with our panelists. So what I'd ask now is that our panelists can join us, and I'm going to very quickly introduce them so we can jump into our discussion. And what I'd like to introduce is, let's see, I see Vas Bednar has joined us. If our other panelists can turn on their cameras as well. Yes, wonderful. So I would like to introduce Maxence Demerlet. She is the Director of Digital Technology and co-chair of the Digital Technology and Innovation Commission of MEDEF. MEDEF is the Mouvement des Entreprises de France, where she represents Business Europe. Vas Bednar is the Managing Director of the Canadian Shield Institute, where she promotes policy innovation to ensure a fair and competitive digital economy. And I'd like to also welcome Pencho Kuzev. He is a policy advisor at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Berlin, where he specializes in the data economy and competition policy, where he focuses on the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. And finally, I'd like to welcome Michael Geist, law professor at the University of Ottawa, Canada Research Chair, Internet and E-commerce law. He focuses broadly on technology law, privacy, and digital policy. Welcome everyone to this panel. To give viewers a sense of our structure here, we have a few questions to ask the panel. I'm going to kickstart it with certain speakers, but we're going to have a broad and free-flowing discussion about these important digital policy issues. And the first question I have is starting broader. You know, the DSA is a major piece of legislation, and it has the potential to influence laws in other jurisdictions, and it did influence the development of our first version of a bill here. You know, it's kind of that quintessential Brussels effect, right? So I want to get a sense of where these laws fit in the law and policy in various countries. So Maxence, if you could kick us off with a kind of talking a bit about the historical, social, and legal context of the DSA in Europe.
Yes, with pleasure, Emily. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. Speaking on behalf of Business Europe, who's the co-chair of the Digital Working Group. And as far as business is concerned, of course, we welcome very much the EU Digital Services Act, because we think it's a kind of a landmark regulation to foster safer and trustworthy online environment. Just as Renate said at the beginning of this webinar, we're coming from, this is the background, the e-commerce directive. You explained it very well. We had at the beginning this legislation, very important, very useful at the beginning. And the DSA roots in the e-commerce directive 2000, so it's like a decade. In fact, we had this legislation. It had set this basic rule saying that the platform is not liable as such at the first intention because of the illegal content the user can upload in the platform. At the limit, of course, they are informed of the illegal content, and they have to, of course, put it away of the platform once notified. So this is what the background, but of course, everyone can realize that between 2000 and 2010, and then 2020, we have the apparition of some of these big platforms. And in somehow we were working in the street, in the internet, landscape, and we then enter a shop, and the rules are changing a lot, because when you are in a platform, you are in a private company and organizing the whole, framework as the company wants. So it's a little bit different area. And then, of course, there have been a demand that this is the social background, I think, the demand for more clear and safer environment. And so the Metcalfe effect, the network effect of this platform has been realized, and some people like professors or economists wrote a lot about this network effect. And the fact that this platform with the way of working with the fact that once they gets it all in the market, they were blasting some more classical business like hospitality, for example. So there's been a demand for more fair competition and a more important regulation. So still, it's not, as Renate said it, of course, very clearly, it's not the content legislation, the Digital Services Act, but it impose and increase responsibility. And as businesses, we want to stress the fact that, of course, there is the part of the Commission, and we will talk a little bit later about the enforcement, but we don't have to forget that this legislation also applies to SMEs or intermediaries company, and they have less, capacity or less knowledge to apply it. So we don't have to forget that SMEs are also impacted by this legislation, and as a representative of businesses, we have all sort of sectors, all sort of size of company, and we have to think about the effect of this legislation, of course, on more small company. And I would like to add the fact that of course, at the beginning of it, the illegal products was very at the beginning, the question of what do we do with that illegal content. But the question of targeting disinformation is also something brand new, I would say, even if Renate explained that there were already some soft laws, some conduct guidelines, etc. But in fact, disinformation relates also to cultural understanding, and we are not, a federated country. We are 27 different countries with different languages, with different cultural background. So we have to learn how to define this disinformation. And I will tell a little bit more about the question of economical disinformation, but there is a threat on democracy. There could be a threat also on companies. So I will go back on that point. And to finish with, I think that the DSA is very important today, and it's so important also to discuss with you the Canadian and other areas to understand better how we can handle the I would say side effects of this platform. So I'm very happy to be there to discuss with you.
Thank you, Maxence. And I think, Michael, this is a great opportunity for you to jump in, because I think the historical, social, and legal context of Canada is quite different.
It is. Thanks, Emily. And thanks to the organizers for including me in this really interesting panel. Canada's been involved, obviously, in digital regulation for a long time. The notion that it's always been about self-regulation isn't really true, but the focus has changed. So early on, it would have been things like copyright, which we spent the better part of a decade dealing with, net neutrality, some of the privacy rules, and harms coming out of online messaging and things like that. But it's only really in the last 5 years that there's been a bit of a shift towards the platforms. And of course, Canada, like so many countries around the world, looks at what other countries are doing. And I think it's fair to say the European models, not just the DSA, but others, have been influential in some of the thinking. And we heard that, I think, from Blair McMurran earlier on. There are, I think, several constraints or issues that Canada faces that are worth highlighting. And if I have time, a couple of words of reflecting on what I think by and large over the last 5 years has not been a particularly successful effort at dealing with these issues. I think, frankly, it's been marked by failure, both in terms of failure to actually pass some of the proposed legislation, and the legislation that has been passed, I think, frankly, has been marked by failure as well in terms of achieving some of the objectives that was hoped for. And some of the challenges, we faced along to get to that point. Some are constitutional, and so there are divisions of powers between federal government and provincial governments, which may limit what our federal government can do, or it may create questions as to whether or not certain federal legislation is constitutional. I think we heard off the top about the online streaming bill and changes that were made from a broadcasting perspective. There is currently a bill in Quebec that purports to deal with many of the same issues around discoverability and the like, and ongoing questions as to which bill, if either bill, actually one of the bills is likely constitutional, but we don't necessarily know which one. And part of that stems from a division of powers around communication. So if the Quebec bill is constitutional, it makes it less likely that the federal law now is. Alternatively, if the federal law is constitutional, then it's hard to see a scenario whereby Quebec's intervention in the space is constitutional. So there are those constitutional issues. There are also Charter of Rights and Freedoms issues. We've already had reference a few times to the decision to exclude disinformation from the online harms bill, and I know we'll continue with some of that discussion, but it seems to me that that choice was, and the issues that were raised by people throughout the consultation raised clear freedom of expression concerns and protections under the charter, and how do you go about addressing what I think most would acknowledge are real harms in some instances, but do so in a way that doesn't trip over some of those expression protections. And it's challenging, and one can understand why, in my view anyway, a decision was made to target content that was more clearly on side from a Charter of Rights and Freedoms perspective. I think there are trade agreement constraints. Emily, you suggested that the DSA and CUSMA CUSMA would not stand in the way of a DSA approach in Canada. I think that's true for some provisions, to be sure, but on some of the core issues around liability for intermediaries. So not so much where you're seeking to put on new kinds of obligations associated with transparency and the like. I don't see significant limitations there. But if at the end of the day, your enforcement is premised on creating liability for online intermediaries, I actually do think that Article 1917 of CUSMA, or the USMCA, creates restrictions on, or limitations. That was perhaps less of an issue under a previous Congress and a previous president. It might have been hard to identify why the US would object, given that there were some concerns even in the US about the CDA Section 230. That is no longer the case, clearly, under the current US administration and the US Congress. And so we just saw with the DST that these are real risks. The notion that we can be dismissive of US retaliation against Canada, in this case, as part of a trade agreement we actually did agree to, I don't think can be easily dismissed. Lastly, quickly, I just wanted to say that, I mentioned, I don't think things have worked well. And part of that, I think, stems from some of the kinds of things, part of the policy strategies we've had, if we look back over the last number of years, and even the way we go about doing things. I would say I've often looked with some amount of envy as to how things like the DSA or the DMA or other of the European directives and regulations have been developed. And it feels a little bit like sausage making when you see so many different groups actively engage in negotiation, and the various, we just heard 27 member states engage in that. We don't get anything close to that. We get all what feels like a fully baked statute in which government, and respectfully, because many of them are on this call, policy officials view almost any change, almost any criticism as being a sign of weakness. And there is a deep reluctance to engage in that very kind of debate. In fact, on some of the kinds of legislation, we heard reference to the online news bill, there was an attempt at the committee to exclude Meta from even appearing before the committee to put forward its perspective. And so I think we've got a bad process where trying to improve a bill is seen as weakness, as opposed to what I think it should be, which is really trying to improve the bill. And lastly, I would say that part of our problem, I think, has been that we have been less focused on trying to constrain behavior in the way that we do see as part of the DSA, trying to establish limits and liability for that, and quite frankly, more interested in profiting from that behavior. And so the efforts have often been to put forward pieces of legislation where the goal isn't to stop behavior that we have concerns with, but rather to say, hey, pay. If you platform, pay to fund Canadian content, or pay to fund the news organizations, or pay this DST, then the kinds of rules that we have don't really change that much. And I think, quite frankly, that's a bad policy choice if the top priority is to actually stop some of the harms rather than sort of basically leveraging it to force platforms to pay.
Maybe I could chase Michael just for a second to say, Michael, going back to your diagnosis of some of the failures, to add, I think Canada has also suffered from a narrative failure, right? We have not told a story about what the core problem or problems are and how we're going to set about going to solve them. So when you look at what comes across as a somewhat piecemeal, clumsy, or at times opportunistic, using the levers that we have, right? we lost a sense of coherence in what was even being brought forward. And that is really important for Canada in this moment, as we're seeking to think about, the right ways, the best ways to curb the harms and sort of celebrate and amplify the positives associated with, I think we're basically just talking about the largest platforms in the world. That's tough work, and tough work to do consistently, but it can also be back to that incoherence, when you're trying to bring forward a broad tech accountability agenda, and you are also taking taxpayer dollars to put advertising on those same platforms, maybe the platform that turned off news for your entire country, you send strange signals as well, right? And that was actually a proposal in this last federal election from the federal Conservatives to say, we will not use tax dollars on these platforms. Now, would they have used them on Rebel News or something like that? Who knows? But I think Canada reasserting this lens on, again, what we're fighting for, what we're protecting, what we're hoping for, and then making some associated decisions with that in the near term seems really important beyond the kind of jurisdictional scanning we're always engaged in as good policy people. Maybe we need to not elevate our jurisdictional scanning so much, right? We're so often a policy taker, not a policymaker. Anyway, thanks for letting me jump in.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And I, Pencho, it made me think of, picking this to you to ask about the EU experience of this, because I think that the notion, the idea of accountability or platform accountability, there's been buy-in for a long time in the EU, and I've always thought that that's partly what has influenced the ability then to have the types of discussions that you had to develop the Digital Services Act.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Timely topic. DSA is not a perfect legislation, but it's a great success for Europe. It took a while in adopting this legislation. But we now make first experiences in the implementation of the DSA, and I can freely say we have some success so far. It's a clear principle what we want to achieve. What is illegal offline should be illegal online as well. And I believe that the experiences of European citizens do not differ from those in Canada, Asia, Australia, or elsewhere. We face the same business model. I'm not a politician, I can say the same toxic business model. We face the same abusive practices, and the polarization in societies is linked to digital platforms and the way we communicate with each other. So platform regulation is not the result of some meddling bureaucrats. It's a result of genuine public concern. The fears regarding platforms have been born out of experiences and plenty of abuse cases. Social media definitely has brought many benefits, but also has left users exposed to threat to violence, promoted self-harm, and plenty of conspiracy theories. It has enabled disinformation to become a weapon against us by a couple of hostile actors. That's our European experience. So the question of how our laws are enforced and how companies are held accountable for the machines they have created are real and definitely legitimate. So we cannot simply leave these decisions to those who profit from them. DSA is definitely a complex matter, complicated matter. We have introduced many concepts. I would just want to mention a couple of them. Trusted flaggers, I'm going to come back to this issue as well. Recommender system transparency, traceability of traders, risk assessment and mitigation, crisis response mechanism, independent audits, plenty of other issues. If there is one recommendation to Canada, make it a bit more simple. The addressee of the DSA are online intermediary services, put it simple, and we are here to dispel some myths, I believe. Let's put it clear, the Commission and the so-called digital service coordinators are no firefighters. They have no competence to evaluate or remove individual content or to block or deblock individual accounts. The European Commission is not responsible for content moderation or the decisions what is illegal or not. All this is still the task of judicial authorities across countries. Renate mentioned already a lot about the structure of the DSA. The DSA identifies, let's say, 4 categories of so-called systemic risk that should be assessed in depth by the providers of very large online platforms. Just want to name them again. The first category of risk is associated with the dissemination of illegal content, such as the dissemination of child sexual abuse material or illegal hate speech. Second category concerns fundamental right, and the third and fourth category of risk concern the actual or foreseeable negative effects on democratic processes, civil discourse, and electoral processes, as well as public security. So according to DSA, platforms should focus on the systems or the other elements that may contribute to those risks, particularly their recommender systems and advertising systems. So evidence is key. Evidence on potential failures to address systemic risk need to be substantial and detailed. When it comes to disinformation, we have introduced the concept of trusted flaggers, the concept that is quite problematic, but to be honest, I don't know any better alternative so far. Trusted flaggers are organizations or individuals recognized by regulators as reliable and expert sources for identifying and reporting harmful content. So they have a big role in fighting disinformation. Platforms give higher priority to content flaggers by trusted flaggers. They have expertise in this area, and there are clear rules how you award the status of trusted flagger. I think Renate mentioned the issue of code of practice. To be honest, after so many years in dealing with gatekeeper platforms, I don't believe that we can achieve what we want to achieve with code of practice. So we need a strict mechanism. We have to face the realities in a different way. And that's why we have the DSA. So I'm going to stop here and looking forward to the further discussion.
I mean, it was interesting. So, you know, you've moved into, I guess, a topic that I wanted to talk about, which was the disinformation. And it's interesting that you say, like, look, the code of practice, we need to be done with that. We need hardened rules under the DSA, because I think, like, for the Canadian context, I think we're further back than that, and that's actually exactly where we need to be starting. It was such a controversial point of debate and about whether to include it. And it was mainly because of the fact that most disinformation is legal. And so it's problematic to pass laws to address it. And the DSA has kind of addressed it by taking on the bigger issues, the ideas of electoral process, the idea of civic discourse, right? Kind of going to that nugget of those democratic threats. And I've really wrestled, like I have really wrestled with how to deal with this issue, that we know this is an existential threat. AI disinformation now is just like, it is now just, you know, on steroids, any of the disinformation we had before. But the legal challenges are important, and in Canada, the charter challenge coming when it comes to free expression is huge. And Vas, maybe I'll turn to you, because there is a really strong competition, consumer protection element to this too, when it comes to mis and disinformation. I know you're working quite a bit in that space.
I feel like I should update my name on the webinar and be like Vas Bednar, not a lawyer, all in caps. But yes, I'll share some thoughts. I mean, often from a policy design perspective, advice I used to give my students at McMaster University, I would sort of say the equivalent of sometimes we can shop our closet, right? What can we work with what we already have from a legislative standpoint to sort of use a particular lens or a particular tool to meet what we are treating as a net new or novel problem because it's taking place in a digital context? And on, intentionally misleading, being intentionally misleading, right? And you mentioned AI elements. I mean, I think there's this whole, emerging body of work around large language models, engaging in a human-like way, right? Or taking on personalities and personas and kind of what that can mean. But through competition law, we address falsity through false and misleading advertising provisions, right? So that's kind of outside of, is this, are you abusing your dominance as a company? Because, whether or not you have dominance in a marketplace, it's sort of a more of a behavioral approach. It doesn't cover disinformation in a political or societal sense. I think we'd really have to stretch that interpretation that false or misleading misrepresentations are made over the course of trade, right? What is occurring on these platforms? What is the exchange? What is the value creation that's occurring? And can we sort of, again, bring that lens that is maybe more familiar and sort of in adjacent places? So I will not go through like the criminal and civil side of this, but we have used these provisions in Canada, not in the mis and disinformation kind of in the digital sphere, but with greenwashing and deceptive environmental claims, right? Claims that are intentionally made to trick people, deceive them, lead them to buy something, lead them to do something. Does that extend to design structures that are designed to hook you or make you believe something or make you more likely to purchase something? Again, not the core kind of dis and misinformation we're talking about, but behavioral prompts and design. Fake reviews and endorsements is something that the Competition Bureau does take on. False pricing, drip pricing that we've seen through elements like Ticketmaster or hotels or even Canada's Wonderland. So sort of when you see those headlines, I always wonder how does it play with like the average person to be like the Competition Bureau is taking on Canada's Wonderland, with for people listening is an amusement park. I think statements like that can actually be really powerful in terms of the state acting on something that is behavioral, in terms of sending a signal around how an actor is behaving in the market. And then that becomes the question. So is election misinformation, conspiracy content, or deepfakes, is that really a non-commercial falsity? Or why is this content, being created and amplified? What is the intention? What are the economic incentives kind of behind it? And is deception sort of not foundational to that? I think it's an interesting debate and could be a productive lens to sort of stretch over to some of this material potentially. And then just as a side note, if anyone wants to make me the chatbot czar of Canada, I'm actually very busy right now, but I would take it on as a side hustle, because I think things like chatbots masquerading as humans, again, just as an aside, is something that should not occur, right? Like there are sometimes smaller adjacent things for us to articulate and clarify that we don't take advantage of doing, maybe because they seem so minuscule in comparison, but sometimes those kind of modest but meaningful interventions, beyond being somewhat symbolic, I think are quite important. I hope that's okay, and I didn't stray too far from our core conversation around the DSA.
No, I actually think it's helpful, because if anyone's going to go then and start reading carefully the DSA, it really does deal with this disinformation two different ways. And correct me if I'm wrong, Pencho and Maxence, but there's the consumer protection side of it too, which is that falsity and the deception, and kind of ensuring that these features are not kind of misleading, and that consumers are very clear on what they're engaging with. And then there's this separate side, which is the broader democratic challenge. And so I might I'm conscious of time, but I really want to ask this question to you, Michael, which is, what do you think, take this idea of like civic discourse and electoral processes being tackled from a disinformation lens, do you think that's something that Canada can do in online harms legislation, or should do?
You asked two questions there at the end. Can we do it and should we do it? I think, if anything is going to pass constitutional muster when it comes to disinformation, I think first there needs to be some sort of intentionality as part of it. I mean, I think if it's just targeting speech is a problem, but if there's an intent to deceive, I think that would be an element that would be key. And then a second element would be in an area that is so obviously important and foundational to a democratic country that I think a court would say this is a reasonable limitation on some of those expression rights. And so I think, democracy itself, of course, and an election would be an obvious candidate for that. So could we do it? I think we could. Should we do it? I would say no. And not because we shouldn't do it, but we shouldn't do it within that online harm structure. One of the other, I think, real mistakes we've made with respect to how we've approached these issues is to treat them almost all within this omnibus style legislative approach, where we bring together multiple strands of digital related concerns and throw it all into a piece of legislation. And that has, I think, significantly undermined, frankly, the ability to get even the small stuff done, or even some big stuff done that for which there is broader agreement on. We saw it play out with privacy and AI, where we lumped together both of those issues. It was a mistake. I think we would have privacy legislation, or modernized privacy legislation right now, had we not taken that approach with what was known as Bill C-27. I think we're seeing it right now on the privacy end with respect to our border bill and the positively horrendous attempt to incorporate lawful access provisions as part of something that really has nothing to do with that. And I think we will see a lot of pushback, at least I hope we will, come the fall. And I think we saw it with online harms. Whether or not we would have passed the core part of the online harms bill that dealt specifically with the responsibilities of the online platforms is an open question. I think there was a decent shot that it would have advanced under the prior parliament, but the decision to include within it both elements of the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act, I think ultimately sunk that legislation, and the government's decision very late in the process to say, well, okay, we'll separate these out, clearly came far too late. And so then I guess the question on the should is, what is the political risk of bringing in elements that are unquestionably going to spark increased levels of controversy and debate around both their constitutionality and even the wisdom, because not everybody will agree on some of this, and they will point to the occasional example and say that this was alleged to be disinformation and it wasn't, and you're intervening in a way in the electoral process that creates some set of risks. I think those are good questions to be debated and discussed, but I think they're good questions to be debated and discussed within its own piece of legislation. And we could do that, and we frankly should put the political party privacy issue, which has also been hived off into another bill where it has no business being, in a true Elections Act, electoral reform piece where disinformation becomes part of it. We've previously, I think, had successful efforts at increased transparency in this space. The ad transparency database that we've seen some of the platforms use comes directly out of this. So I think there is room to do this, but I would rather see success right now in a sensible, slimmed down online harms bill than sort of see a repeat of what we just experienced with one that really struggles to get over the finish line, given an attempt to cobble together so many other things.
I know I always struggled with that, and that I think that I'd love to see disinformation addressed in a particular way, but I fear right now, like politically, it would tank a bill. From a policy perspective, I think it's really important to address even in a softer way if there's some role to start developing codes of practice or working with various stakeholders to work on some of these issues, and maybe learn from some of the efforts right now from the EU. And Maxence, you have your hand up, so I'm really interested then what you have to say on this topic.
Yes, it's really interesting, this debate. I would like to stress the fact that the debate on the DSA just occurred just after or in the middle of the 19 COVID crisis, and then the enter to war, the Russia against Ukraine. So the question of disinformation just popped up in the debate, and perhaps we took the subject going on. And in fact, today the debate is evolving, of course, and I think we will have in the implementation some sort of adaptation. Of course, disinformation, there is no clear definition of what is it. Is it misleading, harmful, politically motivated or not? Which, well, still is a debate very interesting. For example, I want to quote the fact that we had in France, or not only on the platforms, on disinformation on companies, which are not directly triggered by the text, because when you have a TikTok trend on trade war against LVMH, for example, as a luxury company all over the world, is it important economically? Yes, but it's not a disinformation given the democratic situation. But it leads to somehow give a false information about the luxury sector or French company, which is important for us as French citizens, because it brings a lot of value and of course employment. So disinformation is somehow a context to evolve, of course. And there is a worry, of course, that private companies become the judges of what's false and true. We don't want any truth ministry. So we have to go along this legislation to make it cope with the new threat. And the new threat, unfortunately, they increase. So in my opinion, the DSA is much more welcome to be here, not to be, because when we have this deep fake AI use, even, we see today in company for boards, for example, we have example of people being replaced in a decision-making board, giving false information or making lead to take a false decision because of the presence of a false person. I'm here in that webinar. How you are sure that I'm the person I pretend I am? This is some brand new. The question is total. So what is the false? What is the truth? Am I Maxence Demerlet or not? Are you the right person you say you are? So this information and the context of false things, truth is somehow evolving. So I think having a legislation so far and to build upon this legislation is very useful. So perhaps I'm not convincing enough, but anyway, I think that the experience we have in Europe is useful. I hope it's useful for other areas and geographies. And I would like to add also, of course, that the responsibility of the Commission is very important, but we have also the responsibility altogether to work to make it works. So, well, it's an ongoing process, and I think it's interesting to have this debate anyway.
No, and I would encourage all the viewers to go read the code of practice on electoral. I think I'm trying to remember the exact name. It was on electoral processes and civic discourse. That was, I think it was the guidelines or the code of practice that sets it down, because it's a really interesting read that dives into kind of the types of support for electoral processes that they want platforms to put in place. Just almost even like heightened manpower on the ground to ensure that they're paying attention to what's happening in those processes. And I think an unexplored question, even in the Canadian context, I've been talking with individuals from, Indigenous groups who are saying that even their elections are being seriously disrupted because of false information being spread on platforms, and that this is they're seeing it in a way as interfering with their Indigenous right to self-determination and kind of their ability to organize and run their own communities and their own elections. So I'll leave it at that. I'm conscious of time, and I invite that anyone watching can post any questions that you have. But in the meantime, I do want to still have a few short discussions on our last points. And one of the first ones that, you know, all the panelists were eager to talk about is this idea of the enforcement regime here, right? So the DSA proposes to build out this kind of, or it doesn't propose, it does build out this administrative framework. And so questions are the workability of this, whether it's something that is enforceable. So maybe I'll kick this first to you, Maxence, to talk about the experience in Europe from even a business perspective of what it's been like implementing the DSA.
Yes, as Business Europe, in fact, we argue that the mandate on European Commission is a critical one. It has a critical challenge ahead, because even if Renate called 14 enforcement action, still we need to demonstrate how far this can go, and of course the Commission is handling the most important and the big platform, but it has also to help the states to enforce nationally and consistently in an harmonized way the legislation also in the countries. And I think that we have a challenge on putting all the regulators online on the same goals to make it apply, because we have this debate here in Europe about, for example, some online e-commerce platform about what we call the fast fashion situation. And for example, we need to align customs, but also competition, and also control authorities for the security of products. And all these authorities are not always aware or organized to work together around the application of the DSA. So we have to learn how to tackle these new problems that were they're completely new. So we have to organize ourselves, and it's a broad framework. So we have to learn how to enforce it. And I would say that I agree with the description that have been made. It has already some impact. So Renate quote the TikTok lead project, for example, but there is also the plan from Meta to have a so-called teenage account for Instagram. So we see that there is more and more pressure about the control of age. I've been to Denmark recently, and they're very, very engaging about the control of age and the protection of minor on the internet. So we see that the DSA is gaining more and more application, and in fact, it has not so many years of improvement. E-commerce length 20 years. So we knew how to operate with the e-commerce directive. Now the DSA, you know, is less than 2 years of enforcement. So I think we have to give some time, but also as businesses to cooperate also when there is an issue, and to better discuss with the authorities to make all together work against these new problems that pop up every day. There is a new issue. So I'm quite positive on the fact that we're gaining experience in enforcement, and we will get to have this platform cooperate, because as Vast said, the very interest is in their revenue. You know, if people they quit the platform, then no more revenue. So I think it's a KPI, if I may say, that they should learn from, and I think that their interest is to cooperate.
Oh,
so we'll
yeah.
see what the other
And honestly, on revenue, it's not that would make a dent by any means in terms of what government expenditure is. It's more just like sending the mixed messaging sometimes that we've had in terms of we are, again, trying to bring forward more accountability or protect people from harms in these different ways. I mean, earlier we heard from the ADM Blair, and apologies Blair, because now they can't respond, that Canada's doing more on ensuring fair remuneration for content creators. I mean, we're not quite doing that, right? We focused on something called discoverability. We're not doing anything around the actual market and like payment and structures like that. So how do we get there? Anyway, I keep taking us on tangents, but that's sometimes a superpower, you know?
So that's it for me.
No, this is wonderful. And there's so much still to talk about, and we are somewhat short on time. And so what I wanted to ask then, I'm going to limit it to 2 questions, and then I might just address, we have 2 questions that have come through the Q&A. So Michael, I wanted to turn to you about enforceability, because I think that was a major point of discussion within Canada. And so what kind of we can learn and not learn from the DSA on this. And then Pencho, I want to jump to you just to talk a bit about algorithmic amplification and freedom of expression, because I know that's been a major point of debate and discussion within the DSA. And so what you've gone through there could help inform Canada's thoughts on this as we hopefully go forward and reintroduce some form of platform regulation. So Michael.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Yeah, I mean, and recognizing it's early days, it's good to hear about some of the successes with the DSA. Some of the stuff I've been reading has been a bit more lukewarm, let's say, about some of the successes so far. For example, there was a lot of expectation or hope that the first round of audits would be quite revealing and have an impact. And I think there's been a fair amount of concern that some of the provisions themselves aren't actually being audited at all, and that that the large auditing companies perhaps are not best suited to do this, or if they are, the results aren't quite meeting expectations, but perhaps that's early stages. The extent to which it is a challenge to play some of that enforcement to play out, I think that frankly reflects what we've seen in Canada. I think the government too often on legislation has punted on some of the really hard questions of implementing, leaving it to a regulator or to future regulations, and then don't have really great answers when those kinds of issues begin to arise. We've talked about discoverability. Some of the questions around some of those issues, or even around algorithmic transparency, both of which came up in our internet streaming bill, but there were very few details to even understand what any of that meant. And we are now seeing years worth of hearings and even some litigation to try to figure out some of those issues. And that's kind of with the processes we've got, one of the other problems we faced is who's going to do some of this stuff, at least from a Canadian perspective. So there's been a tendency to bounce some of this to our broadcasting and telecom regulator, who is now given responsibility for internet related issues. At least at this stage, it's not entirely clear that they are ideally situated to deal with some of that. There are internet issues they can deal with well in terms of access and wireless connectivity and those sorts of things. Once they get more and more into some of the content and that sort of regulation piece, it isn't as good a fit. We've seen attempts to get the privacy commissioner involved, but the privacy commissioner doesn't even have order making power in our country. And so if we're already thinking that it's a drop in the bucket when we think about some of the fining powers, even the big fining powers coming out of Europe, try to enforce some of this stuff when you can't even force them to do any fines at all, or force platforms to do anything. It's not an effective technique. The Competition Bureau, VAS has already highlighted, they've got limitations as well, plus they've got a competition tribunal that then provides some level of oversight. And if we get into new entities, and the government has proposed new entities, AI and Data Commissioner, a privacy tribunal, amongst them, there are questions about who pays, what level of expertise. We've seen proposals put forward a privacy tribunal in which I think the initial proposal was 1 of 6 of the members of the tribunal needed to have some amount of privacy expertise. It's hard to understand what the drafters were thinking, but even more how that would pass any sort of muster if it was ever goes to court, and court is asked whether or not to grant deference to those decisions when there's no apparent expertise at the tribunal itself. So these are really hard questions, and I often feel and fear that the discussions we have around trying to shape the best possible legislation feels as if we can put up a mission accomplished sign once we pass that legislation, without thinking about what happens the day after. And too often we don't pay attention to it. And then too often we find ourselves with legislation that actually doesn't work in practice or struggles to actually be enforced because we didn't put enough attention to actually how will this work beyond what does the shape of the legislation itself look like.
Yeah, the administrative structure keeps me up at night as well, thinking that through. And I would say I cannot imagine an online harms regulator in Canada if you're not filling that with experts. I think it's the number one criteria with something that is such a nuanced area. We need that. And that takes us actually to a very nuanced area, which Pencho will talk about, which is also one of my favorite topics, which is algorithmic amplification and issues of freedom of expression. This is something that, you know, is such a major point of discussion. There's been litigation in the States where algorithmic amplification has been such a focus. And so, Pencho, maybe you can just kind of bring us home with sort of some discussion about how the EU addresses these points. Now, conscious of time, I think that, you know, we really should, you know, close this down in the next few minutes, and then we will be inviting in some closing remarks from Konstantinos. So take it away.
Yeah, Renata mentioned many important things, but if I ask myself currently what matters for Europe, that's the integrity of elections, because of a couple of terrible experiences we've made in the last couple of months, and there are plenty of upcoming elections in Europe. So recommender algorithms shape Europe's political debate. According to Eurobarometer, basically all young people take their information on social media, especially Europeans under 30. There are clear indications algorithmic feeds suppress Europe's trustworthy journalism, amplify disinformation and authoritarians, and censor other voices. Recommender systems reward volume, velocity, and engagement. By flooding platforms with high-performing but inauthentic signals, bots trick the algorithm into believing that a particular message or figure is popular. So the old model of door knocking has been replaced by trending tabs, suggested videos, and auto-populated timelines. Bots do not vote, but they decide what voters see. And this is not a bug. It's a feature of the current platform economy. Distribution is everything. The faster a message reaches the algorithm's threshold for trending, the more likely it is to be shown to undecided, disengaged, or curious voters. That distribution is what transformed Nawrocki, that's a candidate in Poland, from a fringe figure into a household name. Let me mention a couple of procedures, several investigations that we have currently in Europe. Onyx, far-right groups benefited from mask bump due to interaction with far-right politicians, more engagement. Far-right jumps in reach often coincide with mass expression of sympathy, mentioning, retweets, public conversations. And then we have done plenty of studies using so-called sock puppet accounts, which indicate that far-right political content is recommended most. For instance, on TikTok, far-right content was over-proportionally represented, 94%, including a considerable part from far-right fan pages as first piece of content related to a political party. On Instagram, users following more extreme political positions were shown more political content. Extreme right-wing content was prioritized regardless of user interest. So, when it comes to freedom of information and an algorithmic amplifier, there are simple solution, maybe usable in Canadian context. I recommend an immediate switch off of recommender algorithms on large US and Chinese social media until they prove safe for democracy. So the action is proportionate to the hazard. Several legal instruments are available to execute this recommendation, basically the GDPR in Europe and the DSA. And this action avoids intrusion upon freedom of expression. It is the artificial amplification which must be limited, not human speech. And internet users, not algorithms controlled by unfriendly foreign powers, should decide what they see and share online.
Thank you. And, you know, it makes me think of a news article I read this morning, actually, that everyone should go look at the CBC, because there was a story about a content farm on YouTube being shut down, and that it was filled with a bunch of AI generated content. It was essentially gaming the recommender system to push content, especially during the election. But the account,
maybe in the actual situation, there is something that we should keep in mind. Since the inauguration day, we deal with gatekeepers, which are at the same time political actors. So keep that also in mind, and keep in mind the consequences for society and democracy if you don't take actions.
Yes, and you know, Canada does occupy a very interesting position where our laws are sort of more balanced and European in nature too, but the kind of culture of freedom of expression is still different. We're very much between, and we're next door to the United States, and that very much influences the approach and the views of law and policy in Canada. You know, we could talk so much more about this, and we can't. And so I will bring it to a close, and I would like to thank you all for your wonderful remarks. There's so many discussions I'd love to pick up with you separately. Sorry we couldn't get to the two questions that were asked that I was going to take up. But I would like to take this moment to invite Konstantinos Kapsaropoulos to come join us to give some closing remarks. He's the Digital and Science Counselor at the Delegation of the European Union to Canada. Welcome.
Thank you, Emily. Everybody knows me as Kostas in Ottawa, in Canada, perhaps more broadly. I would like, first of all, to reassure you there will be more opportunities to discuss on this issue, so do not worry if you have not covered everything. These topics are immense, they are very broad, and I can assure you there will be other outreach activities organized by the European Union delegation in Canada. I had kept initially that as a third point, but I wanted to start with that because I wanted to reassure you there will be more discussions about these very important topics. But before that, I would like, first of all, to conclude by thanking everybody who participated to today's webinar, the speakers from the EU and the Canadian public authorities, and also you all in the panel that you have really enriched with your insights. I have learned a lot, and it's always challenging to conclude after so many experts have said so many important and interesting things. And I hope also that our auditors have learned also things. What I would like to say and conclude is that under the EU and Canada Digital Partnership, we really want to bring both jurisdictions as close as possible together in the digital field. As one of the speakers in the panel said, all citizens, wherever we are in Europe or in Canada or in America or in Asia, we share the same experiences. That's why we have built the partnerships, the digital partnerships, in order to together shape and try to face the challenges, the online challenges that we all face worldwide. What is very important with the partnership is that we didn't want to have only discussions between public authorities, but really to include stakeholders from businesses, from civil society, academics. That's what makes the power of the digital partnership. And that's where I would like to conclude. We will have, as I said, more opportunities to discuss, to engage, to talk. The EU delegation will be here to help on that. And also a big thanks to the team which organized this very interesting webinar. More is to come. Please stay tuned. Thank you very much.